The day Renata Voss turned 62, her daughter-in-law brought a cake to the house on Halford Street and set it on the kitchen table without being asked, which was the first sign that something had already been decided. The cake was store-bought, white frosting, the kind with the sugar roses that taste like nothing but look like an effort. Renata had made every birthday cake in that house for 31 years, had learned each person's preference the way you learn a language through daily use until it becomes something you no longer think about. Marcus liked lemon. Dominic liked chocolate with the ganache poured while still warm. She had made those cakes in that kitchen, in the pan she'd had since before either of them was born, and the fact that someone had arrived with a box from a grocery store on her birthday in her own kitchen told her, with the quiet clarity of something finally made plain, that the kitchen was no longer being considered hers. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her name was Renata Voss, and she had lived in the house on Halford Street in Claremont, Ohio, for 31 years. She had moved in at 31 as a new wife with a husband named Gerald and a set of copper-bottomed pots she had bought with the last of her savings from teaching elementary school in Columbus, and the particular hopefulness of a woman who has found the right person at the right time and is prepared to build something lasting with him. She had not been wrong about Gerald. He had been the right person. What she had not accounted for, what no one accounts for, because accounting for it requires imagining a future you are not willing to imagine, was that the right person could still leave. Not through choice, not through abandonment, but through the simple and devastating arithmetic of a body that stops. Gerald died 11 months ago. A Tuesday in February, which was the kind of day that has no softness in it, gray sky and cold ground and the particular bleakness of a month that has not yet decided whether to end. He had been 67. They had been married 31 years. He had been, in all the ways that matter and in several that are difficult to articulate, the organizing principle of her life, not because she had no self without him, but because 31 years of building something together creates a structure, and when half the structure is suddenly absent, what remains is not ruin exactly, but something that requires careful attention to keep standing. She had been keeping it standing. She was good at keeping things standing. She had been doing it her entire life, had learned it early as the younger of 2 daughters in a family that required resourcefulness, and had practiced it for 31 years of marriage and 22 years of teaching other people's children and the daily management of a house and a garden and a life. She was capable and organized, and she knew it, and she had spent the 11 months since Gerald's death demonstrating this to herself and anyone who happened to be watching, which included her 2 sons, Marcus, 38, and Dominic, 35, and their respective wives, Priya and Carla, and the overlapping community of neighbors and friends who had circled with the specific attentiveness of people waiting to see how someone is going to handle the thing they are handling. She had handled it. She had made the arrangements and sorted the accounts and dealt with the estate and maintained the house and the garden and her own interior life with the organized attention she brought to all things. She had grieved in the specific and private way of a woman who has always understood that grief is personal work that does not benefit from an audience. She had done it without falling apart, without requiring rescue, without becoming the burden that she could see her sons quietly and carefully worrying she might become. And they had worried. She could see it in the quality of their attention, which had changed after Gerald died in the way of people who have reclassified someone. She had been Renata, their mother, capable and present, a fixed point. She had become, in the months since Gerald's death, something that required monitoring. They called more. They visited with the particular frequency of people performing a welfare check rather than simply wanting to be there. They asked questions about how she was managing, whether the house was too much, whether she had thought about her options, which was the word they used, options, as if the house she had lived in for 31 years was something she might trade in for something more practical. The cake on the kitchen table was Carla's doing. Carla was Dominic's wife and the most organized person Renata had ever met, which she had admired for years and was now finding somewhat different to admire in the context of what it was being organized toward. Carla had printed an agenda for the birthday lunch and brought it in a folder, which Renata had understood immediately was not an agenda for a birthday lunch but an agenda for a conversation that had been planned well in advance of the birthday and was using the birthday as a civilized container. The folder was cream-colored with a small bow on the tab. Carla had thought about this detail. Marcus and Priya arrived at 12:15. Dominic came in from the kitchen where he had been with Carla, and they all sat in the living room, and the folder was placed on the coffee table, and Renata sat in the chair she had always sat in, the one by the window with the view of the garden, and she looked at her sons and their wives and she thought, here it is. They had been working up to this for months. She had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when you have lived in a place long enough to read the sky. The house, they said, was too large for one person. This was true in the way that many true things are incomplete. It was a 4-bedroom house. She used one bedroom and the study and the kitchen and the garden, which she used extensively, and the living room where she was sitting now. She did not use the 2 guest rooms except when Marcus's children came to stay, which they did 4 times a year, or when her sister visited from Pittsburgh, which she did twice. The house was, by a certain accounting, large for one person. It was also her home. These facts existed simultaneously and did not cancel each other out. The finances were a concern, they said. Gerald's pension had been substantial, but it was Gerald's pension, and the portion she now received was smaller, and the house carried taxes and maintenance, and they were worried, they said, genuinely, about her being stretched. This was the part of the conversation that had the most truth in it. The finances were not catastrophic, but they were tighter than they had been, and Renata had been aware of this and had been making adjustments with the methodical attention she brought to all problems, cutting where she could, rethinking where she could not cut. She had not shared the details of this management with her sons because she had not thought it was their business and because sharing it would have made this conversation happen sooner. There was a community, Priya said gently, in Westfield, 20 minutes away. It was specifically designed for active seniors, which was the phrase currently used for people who did not yet need medical oversight but whose children had begun to think it was coming. The community had a pool and organized activities and a social director and units that were, Priya said, really beautiful. They had visited and taken photographs. The photographs were in the folder. Renata looked at the photographs in the folder. They were indeed beautiful in the way of places designed to look desirable in photographs. The units were light-filled and had granite countertops and the particular aesthetic of somewhere that has been carefully staged to communicate a specific message about what living there would feel like. She noted that none of the photographs showed the view from the window. She noted that the units were 900 square feet, compared to the house's 2,200. She noted that the monthly fee was $3,200, plus a community assessment, plus optional services. She did the arithmetic without writing it down. It was more than the house cost her to maintain. She said, very calmly, because she had been preparing for this conversation for months and was not going to have it on their terms, I need to think about this. Marcus said, Mom, we want to make sure you're okay. She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 38 years. She knew every version of his face. I am okay, she said. I need to think about this. They ate the birthday cake. It tasted like the effort it looked like, which was to say it did not taste like a birthday cake. Renata made a mental note about the sugar roses. That night, after they left, she sat at the kitchen table alone and thought with the focused attention of someone who has been given a problem she intends to solve herself. She was not angry. She had decided a long time ago that anger required energy that was better spent on thinking, and she had been through enough things in her 62 years to know that this was a reliable principle. She was also not afraid, which she had expected she might be and was not, because the thing they were presenting as a solution was less frightening than the problem they were describing, and the problem they were describing was not her actual situation. Her actual situation was specific and had specific solutions if you were willing to think them through rather than accepting the first option someone brought in a cream-colored folder. The house was an asset. This was the beginning of the thinking that mattered. She had paid it off, she and Gerald together, 8 years ago, and it was hers entirely, which meant it was worth what the market said it was worth, which she looked up the next morning and found was significantly more than she had expected. Claremont had changed in the years they had lived there. Property values had done what property values do in towns where something draws people, and something had drawn people to Claremont over the past decade: a university expansion, a hospital, the particular quality of the older neighborhoods with the old trees and the houses that were built to last. The house on Halford Street, according to the 3 comparison listings she examined, was worth between $380,000 and $420,000. She was not going to sell it. She had been clear about this with herself from the moment the folder appeared on the coffee table. The house was Gerald's house and hers, was 31 years of the life they had built, and she was not going to hand it to a real estate agent so that Marcus and Dominic could stop worrying. But the house was also an asset that was producing nothing while she sat in it, and assets that produce nothing are a choice, and she was reconsidering her choices. She began to think about other things instead. She had been teaching herself, in the months since Gerald died, to think about other things instead of grief, not because the grief was not real, but because grief at sufficient intensity becomes a closed loop, and she was not a woman who functioned well in closed loops. She needed forward motion. She needed a problem she could actually solve. Gerald's brother, Warren, had died 3 years before Gerald, and had left Gerald something in his will. Not much. Warren had been a bachelor his entire life, a man who had spent 40 years as a surveyor in rural properties across southeastern Ohio, and who had accumulated over those 40 years a particular kind of wealth that is not visible on a balance sheet, which was the knowledge of land. He had known land the way Renata knew gardens, with the intimate attention of someone who has spent decades in direct contact with a thing. He had left Gerald a small property, part of a tract of land he had acquired piece by piece over 30 years in a rural county called Caldwell, an hour and a half southeast of Claremont, in the hill country where the old farms were and the land was cheap and the people who had been there for generations were the kind of people who stayed until something forced them to leave. Renata had never seen the property. Gerald had driven out there once, 2 years before he died, had gone alone on a Saturday in October and come home in the evening with mud on his boots and a quality of quiet about him that she recognized as the quiet of a man who had thought about something important and had not yet decided what to say about it. She had asked and he had said it was just land, some old farm buildings, nothing much, and she had accepted this because Gerald said things when he was ready to say them and not before, and she had learned over 31 years that patience with his timing was more productive than pressing. He had never said anything more about it. Then he died, and the property passed to her, and the estate lawyer had listed it in the inventory with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone accounting for a minor asset, 43 acres, Caldwell County, including structures, value estimated at $17,000. She had noted it. She had not done anything about it. She had been managing everything else, and 43 acres in Caldwell County with structures of uncertain condition had not risen to the top of the list. She found the property deed in the filing cabinet where Gerald kept his important documents, in a folder labeled simply Warren, in the clear and legible handwriting of a man who had been organized about everything except the things that troubled him most. The deed was dated 1987. Warren had paid $4,000 for it, which told her something about both the time and the place. She found in the same folder a hand-drawn map, the kind a surveyor would make, with property lines and compass markings and a few notations in Warren's handwriting, not Gerald's, indicating the location of a farmhouse and what appeared to be several outbuildings and, at the far edge of the property, a notation that simply said Old Mill, 1912. She looked at the hand-drawn map for a long time. She thought about Gerald coming home with mud on his boots. She thought about the quiet quality of him that evening. She thought about the fact that he had never told her what he had found when he went there. The decision formed the way her best decisions always did, not as a sudden arrival but as a slow crystallization of things she had already been thinking, resolving into a shape she recognized as right before she could fully articulate why. She was going to go see it. Not to sell it, not as a solution to the money problem, not because Marcus and Dominic were pushing her towards something she didn't want. She was going to go see it because Gerald had gone there and come home changed, and she wanted to understand what he had found. She called her friend Bet, who had been her closest friend for 20 years and who answered on the second ring at 7:30 in the morning with the alert readiness of a woman who has always been a morning person and has never apologized for it. "I'm going to drive out to the property in Caldwell County," Renata said. "The one Gerald's brother left him." Bet said, "When?" "Saturday," Renata said. "I thought you might want to come." Bet said, "I'll bring coffee." "What time?" They drove out on a Saturday morning in late March when the Ohio Hill Country was doing what it does in late March, which is to be brown and gray and wet in the specific way of a place that is about to become something entirely different but has not yet made the transition. The GPS lost confidence twice on the county roads, which were the kind of narrow unpaved roads that wind through valleys and over ridges without the straight geometry of planned routes, and Renata navigated the last 4 miles from the hand-drawn map, which turned out to be both accurate and entirely idiosyncratic, the kind of map made by someone who knows a place so well that scale and proportion matter less than landmarks. The farmhouse appeared first, visible from the crest of a ridge before the road descended toward it. It was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure of old brick that had weathered to a dark rose color, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front and a stone chimney at each end. The windows were intact, which surprised her. She had expected broken glass, the entropy of an abandoned structure. The windows were shuttered with old wooden boards, nailed from the outside, which was different from broken. Shuttered was deliberate. Shuttered meant someone, at some point, had closed this place with the intention of protecting it. The farmyard was overgrown in the dense and patient way of land that has been left alone long enough to begin reclaiming itself. There were the remains of a fence, the posts still standing at regular intervals with the wire between them collapsed or missing. There were 2 outbuildings she could see, a barn whose roof had partially given way on one side, and a smaller structure that might have been a smokehouse or a storage shed, still intact. The road ended at a gate, iron, rusted to the particular orange-brown of metal that has been in weather for decades. The gate was padlocked. Renata had the key. It was on the ring with the property documents, a large old-fashioned iron key, not a modern lock mechanism. She had not known what it was for until she saw the padlock on the gate, and then she knew immediately. She got out of the car. She walked to the gate. She fit the key into the padlock and turned it, and it resisted for a moment, and then released with the specific giving way of a mechanism that has been waiting to be used. Bet said, from behind her, "Well." Renata said nothing. She pushed the gate open and stood there, looking at the farmyard, at the brick house with its shuttered windows, at the March sky above it, gray and immense and beginning, barely, to lighten towards something that might eventually become spring. She thought about Gerald in October with mud on his boots. She thought about the quiet he had brought home. She thought about what a man like Gerald, careful and precise, would have seen when he stood where she was standing. She walked forward into the farmyard. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and her boots left prints in the mud as she crossed toward the house. Up close, the brick was even more striking than it had been from the ridge, dark rose deepening to near burgundy in the places where the overhang had kept it sheltered, lighter and worn where decades of Ohio weather had done their work. Someone had built this house to last. The mortar was old, lime mortar, she could see it in the joints, the kind used before Portland cement became standard. This was not a house built in a hurry by someone who expected to leave. She stepped onto the covered porch. The boards were weathered but solid, no give beneath her feet, no creak of rotted wood warning her away. The porch ceiling was intact. There were 2 old chairs, wooden, the paint long since flaked away, positioned to face the farmyard and the ridge beyond. Someone had sat in those chairs and looked at that ridge. She thought about that, about the ordinary persistence of it, the domestic fact of 2 chairs arranged for looking. The front door was massive, old-growth oak, she thought, dark with age, fitted with an iron handle and a keyhole that matched the key she was holding. She looked at the key. She looked at the keyhole. She fit the key in and turned it. The lock gave with less resistance than the gate had. As if it had been expecting her sooner. The interior air that came out when she pushed the door open was cool and still and carried the particular smell of a closed space, old wood and dust and something else underneath those things, something that was not decay but was closer to preservation, the smell of a place that had been sealed rather than abandoned. There is a difference. Abandoned things rot. Sealed things wait. Bet came up behind her. They stood in the doorway together and looked. The front room was large, with a stone fireplace on the far wall and wide plank floors, chestnut, she thought, or oak, dark with age and still solid, and the remains of furniture pushed to the walls, covered with canvas drop cloths gone gray with dust. The windows were shuttered from the outside, but the shutters were not tight, and thin blades of light came through the gaps, laying themselves across the floor in long pale lines. Dust moved in those lines of light when they entered, rising and settling in the slow way of particles undisturbed for a long time. There were no signs of water damage on the ceiling or the walls. No smell of mold. The fireplace surround was intact, carved stone, a simple design but deliberate, the kind of work that required skill and time. She walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. Bet was quiet beside her. Bet had the quality of a good friend, which was knowing when not to say anything. There was a staircase along the right wall, the banister intact, the balusters all present, no missing boards on the treads that she could see from below. There was a door at the back of the front room that led, she supposed, to the kitchen, and another that led, she would discover later, to a parlor with bookshelves built into the walls on both sides of the fireplace, shelves still holding a row of books, spines turned gray with dust. She did not understand yet what she was looking at. She was only beginning to look. What she understood, standing in that front room with the light coming through the gaps in the shutters and the dust rising around her feet, was that this place had not been left carelessly. Someone had covered the furniture. Someone had shuttered the windows. Someone had locked the gate and the door with the same key that had been on the ring with the property documents in Gerald's filing cabinet under the tab labeled Warren, in a folder she had found on the fourth morning after deciding she was not going to sign anything put in front of her by her sons or their wives. Someone had taken care about leaving this place. She was not the first person to have stood in this room and understood that. She was, she suspected, the first person in a very long time. She went back to the car and got the flashlight she had brought on the reasonable assumption that an abandoned property would not have functioning electricity, and she was correct, and she spent the next 2 hours walking through the house with Bet at her side, opening doors, and lifting canvas drop cloths and pressing her palm to walls and floors to feel the solidity of what was beneath her hands. The house was 8 rooms on 2 floors. The kitchen at the back was a large room with a wood range still in place and a dry sink and a long worktable of thick old wood that had the character of something that had been used hard for a century and was still fundamentally sound. The parlor with the bookshelves. A dining room. A small room off the kitchen that might have been a pantry or a housekeeper's room. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms, each with its own fireplace, cast iron this time, simpler than the downstairs stone, and the same wide plank floors and the same evidence of careful shuttering, careful covering, the same quality of a place that had been prepared for an absence that someone hoped would not be permanent. The books in the parlor, when she brought the flashlight close, were old. Not decorative old, not purchased by the volume from an antique shop. Actually old, used and read, some of them with names written in the front covers in the faded ink of people who had owned and read them before the habit of writing your name in books stopped being universal. She could not read all the names. The handwriting of the earliest ones defeated her. But in several she found a name that was not Warren Voss and not Gerald Voss, but was a name she recognized because Gerald had mentioned it once, his grandfather's uncle, the one who had built in Caldwell County before the war, before the family moved north to where the work was. She stood in the parlor with the flashlight on the book and the name written inside it, and she felt the particular sensation of a thread connecting to a thing it had always been connected to, of a story that had seemed complete, revealing another chapter. She called Marcus that evening. Not to report, not to update him on her situation or respond to the folder with the cream-colored bow. She called him to tell him she had been to the property in Caldwell County and that she was going back next week and the week after, and that she would be spending some time working on what she found there, and that she was fine, and that she wanted him to know because he was her son and she believed in keeping family informed of her plans. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, that property is in the middle of nowhere. The structure is probably not safe." She told him about the floors and the windows and the shuttered care of it. She told him about the stone fireplace and the built-in bookshelves and the name in the books. She did not tell him about the key, because the key was hers, and she was not yet sure what it opened, and she had learned over 62 years that some things should be understood before they are shared. He said he would like to see it. She said she would take him when she was ready to have company. He accepted this in the slightly careful way of a son who has not yet given up worrying but who has learned, over 38 years, that arguing with his mother about what she is going to do is not a productive use of anyone's time. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the hand-drawn map Warren had made, the one with the property lines and the compass markings and the notation at the far edge of the property, Old Mill, 1912. She had not made it to the far edge of the property today. She had spent the 2 hours in the house and had not had time for the land beyond. The mill was out there somewhere, at the edge of the 43 acres, which she now began to understand were not a minor asset at the bottom of an estate inventory list. She did not know that yet, not fully. She was only at the beginning of knowing it. But she put her finger on the notation on the map Old Mill, 1912 and held it there for a moment, as if she could feel through the paper what Warren Voss had felt when he first walked out to that edge of the property and found what was there, waiting, sealed, patient in the way of things that have learned to wait because they have something worth waiting for. She went back on a Wednesday, alone this time, because what she needed to do required the particular quality of attention that company, even good company, makes harder to sustain. She brought the flashlight and a thermos of coffee and a hand-drawn map and a notebook, because she had always thought better when she was writing things down, had kept a household notebook for 31 years in which she recorded everything from grocery lists to repair schedules to the names of the plants in the garden and what they needed in each season. The notebook was a habit so old it was indistinguishable from thinking itself. She parked at the gate and unlocked it with the iron key and walked the farmyard in the full morning light, which was better than the March light of the previous Saturday, still cool but with the particular brightness of a day that has decided to be useful. She walked the house first, all 8 rooms again, more slowly this time, taking notes. She measured the rooms with the tape measure she had brought, wrote the dimensions in the notebook, noted the condition of the floors and the walls and the ceilings with the methodical attention she had brought to every house project of the past 30 years. She opened every window shutter from inside where she could reach the latches, and the rooms filled with morning light and revealed themselves more fully than the flashlight had allowed. What she saw in the full light confirmed and deepened what she had understood on Saturday. This house had been built with the intention of permanence. The joinery of the built-in bookshelves in the parlor was hand-cut, the kind of precision that requires skill developed over years, not the machine-cut regularity of later construction. The white plank floors were pegged, not nailed wooden pegs, countersunk, the method used before wire nails became cheap and universal. The stone fireplace surround in the front room was carved from a single piece of local limestone. She could see the vein of the stone running through it, and whoever had cut it had understood the grain and worked with it rather than against it. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She did not know yet what it meant in terms of value, formal or otherwise, but she knew what it meant in terms of what kind of people had built this place and what kind of relationship they had intended to have with it. People who peg floors and hand-cut joinery do not plan to leave. The books in the parlor she examined more carefully in the good light. There were 43 of them, she counted, ranging in subject from practical farming and surveying manuals to history and several volumes of poetry that she had not expected, and that she found herself looking at for a longer moment before writing them in the notebook. The names written in the front covers covered 3 generations by her estimate, the handwriting changing in the way handwriting changes when a family moves through time and education changes and the particular style of a period shifts. The earliest name she could read with confidence was Renata Voss, written in the careful copperplate of someone who had learned to write when handwriting was taught as a serious skill. Renata Voss. She did not know this name. She wrote it in the notebook. She spent the middle portion of the morning on the outbuildings. The barn was compromised on one side where the roof had given way, but the main structure was sound post and beam construction, the timbers massive and dark with age, the joinery again hand-cut, mortise, and tenon with wooden pegs. She did not go far into the collapsed section. She was careful about what she walked on and what she stood under and trusted the structural intelligence she had developed over 30 years of managing a house to tell her when something was not safe. The sound section of the barn was solid. The smaller outbuilding, the one she had thought might be a smokehouse, turned out to be a springhouse, built over a small natural spring that still ran. She could hear the water before she opened the door and see it when she did, a clear thread of water moving through a stone-lined channel cut into the floor. The springhouse was intact. The spring still flowed. She stood in the doorway and looked at the water moving in the stone channel and thought about the woman or women who had used this spring for how many decades, carrying water to the house, keeping things cool in summer in the stone-cold air of the springhouse. She thought about continuity, about what it meant that the spring was still there, still doing what it had always done, indifferent to the absence of the people who had built the channel around it. She wrote the springhouse in the notebook. She wrote the spring. After the outbuildings, she walked the land. She had brought the hand-drawn map and she walked it section by section, orienting herself by the compass markings Warren had made, crossing fields that were overgrown with the particular combination of grasses and shrubs and young trees that establish themselves when cultivated land is left alone for a decade or two. The soil, where she pressed her boot into it, was dark and dense, the black soil of bottomland that has been accumulating organic matter for a very long time. She was a gardener. She knew good soil when she felt it. She followed the property line along a creek, the creek noted on the map as running the full eastern edge of the 43 acres. It was a substantial creek, not the seasonal trickle of an intermittent drainage, but a real stream with a gravel bed and clear water and the particular life of a healthy waterway. She could see the movement of small fish near the banks, could hear the sound of it from 20 feet away. The creek ran north to south along the property edge and then curved at the southern boundary and moved westward, and it was at this curve, at the far southwestern corner of the 43 acres, that she found what Warren had marked on the map. The mill. She saw it first from 30 yards away, coming through a stand of young sycamores, and she stopped walking when she saw it, not from surprise exactly, but from the specific sensation of a thing being larger and more present than you had allowed yourself to expect. The mill was built of the same dark brick as the farmhouse, which meant the same hands, or at least the same source, which meant it predated the shift in local building materials in the early 20th century. The notation on the map said 1912, but looking at the brick and the construction, she thought the mill itself was older and the notation perhaps referred to a renovation or an addition, because the masonry of the main walls had the character of the 19th century, not the 20th. The building was 2 stories, the upper portion slightly cantilevered over the creek, and she could see the remains of the mill race, the channel that had directed water from the creek to power the wheel itself gone or rotted, the wooden mechanism that had connected water to work long since surrendered to time. But the stone walls of the mill race were intact. The brick of the mill was intact. The door was on the upstream side, facing the curve of the creek, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron straps in the manner of a building that had needed to be secured against something, which might have been weather or might have been the simple practicality of a working mill that contained valuable equipment and was located at the edge of a property. The door was not padlocked. It was secured by a wooden bar across the inside, which meant the last person to leave had barred it from the inside and exited through another way, or had barred it and then gone around to do so, or had left it barred decades ago and someone had barred it again on a later visit. She walked around the mill looking for the other way in. She found it on the downstream side, a smaller door, lower, the kind of access used for maintenance rather than regular entry, and this door was secured with a padlock, modern, newer than anything else she was looking at, the kind of padlock you buy at a hardware store when you want something to stay closed. She did not have a key for this padlock. The iron key she carried had been for the gate and the house. There was no second key on the ring. She stood and looked at the padlock. She thought about Gerald in October with mud on his boots. She thought about the quality of quiet he had brought home, the specific quality she associated with a man who had seen something he did not yet know what to do with. She thought about the fact that the padlock was newer than everything else here, newer by decades, purchased and installed deliberately by someone who had come to this place and found reason to close it more firmly than the wooden bar on the other door. She thought about Warren, who had bought this property in 1987 for $4,000 and had held it for 30 years until he died and left it to Gerald. Warren the surveyor, who had spent 40 years reading land in southeastern Ohio, who had known what he was looking at when he looked at it. Who had bought a 43-acre farm with a brick farmhouse and a springhouse and a barn and a mill for $4,000 and had never sold it. She wrote in the notebook, "Mill secured, newer padlock, no key on ring." She wrote, "Who put this lock on and when?" She wrote, "Warren." She drove back to Claremont with the windows down and the late afternoon Ohio air coming in, still cold but with the beginning of something warmer in it, the way March sometimes relents toward its end and offers a preview of what is coming. She was thinking the way she thought best, which was in the forward motion of a car on a familiar road with the details of a problem arranging themselves in the order they needed to be addressed. She needed to find out more about the property's history. She needed to find someone who knew Caldwell County and what had been there and what had left, and she needed to find a second key, or a way to understand why the first one had not been provided. She was beginning to understand, to know what Warren had known. The Caldwell County Historical Society operated out of a converted storefront in the county seat, Caldwell proper, in a building that had the organized and slightly dusty quality of an institution run by people who care deeply about what they are preserving and have limited resources with which to preserve it. Renata arrived on a Friday morning, having called ahead and spoken with a woman named Dorothea Hale, who was the society's director and archivist and, as it turned out, the woman who answered the phone because she was the only person there full-time. Dorothea was 70 and had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades in the company of the past without losing her grip on the present, alert, specific, with the rapid cross-referencing attention of a mind that has been cataloging things for a very long time. She welcomed Renata with the particular warmth of someone who receives visitors rarely enough that each one is genuinely interesting, and she listened to what Renata had come to ask with the full attention of a person for whom a question like this is precisely the right kind of question. "The Voss property," Dorothea said, immediately, without hesitation, without needing to look anything up. "I know it. Everyone who has been in this county long enough knows it." Renata waited. Dorothea told her to sit down and she would make coffee and then she would tell her what she knew, which she said would take a little time, because some histories are short and some are long and the Voss history in Caldwell County was the long kind. The coffee was strong and the telling took an hour and 20 minutes and Renata filled 6 pages of her notebook. The mill, Dorothea said, had been built in 1887 by a man named Elias Voss, the name from the books in the parlor, who had come to Caldwell County from Pennsylvania with a wife and 3 children and the specific ambition of someone who has identified a place where the combination of good water and productive land and the absence of competition creates an opportunity. The creek was ideal for a mill. The land around it was good farmland, and the nearest existing mill was 12 miles away, which in 1887 was a significant distance for farmers hauling grain. Elias Voss had seen this and had acted on it. The mill had operated for nearly 40 years, through Elias's lifetime and into his son's. The farmhouse had been built in 1891, 4 years after the mill, when the operation was established enough that a permanent family home made sense. The farm had grown around both the mill and the house, in the way of properties that are run by people who understand that land and the structures on it are the same investment and require the same attention. The son, Dorothea said, his name was Thomas, had run the operation through the 1920s, which was when things had changed. The Depression had done what it did to rural Ohio, which was different from what it did to the cities but was its own particular devastation, and the mill had stopped operating around 1932 and Thomas had died in 1938 without direct heirs. The property had passed to a cousin, and the cousin had not lived there, had used the farmhouse intermittently as a hunting property, and had finally sold it in pieces in the 1960s. The mill parcel and the original farm acreage had been sold several times before Warren Voss had acquired it in 1987. Renata asked about Warren. Had Dorothea known him? Dorothea had known him. He had come to the Historical Society early in his ownership, she said, had come to ask about the mill specifically, and they had spent several afternoons going through the society's records together. He had been, she said, a man who understood what he had found. He had not been surprised by it, she thought, but he had been, she paused, looking for the right word. He had been respectful. The way you are respectful in the presence of something that has weight. Renata asked what Warren had found. Dorothea looked at her for a moment. She said, "Did you go inside the mill?" Renata said no. She said the smaller door had a padlock on it that she didn't have a key for. Dorothea said, "I imagine Warren put that padlock on. He mentioned he was going to. He wanted to make sure it was secure." Renata asked again, gently, what was inside. Dorothea got up and went to the filing cabinets along the back wall and opened the second one from the left and found, after a brief search, a folder. She brought it back to the table and opened it and laid out several photographs, black and white, taken in what looked like the interior of the mill. Renata looked at the photographs. She looked at them carefully, the way she looked at everything that required understanding. She looked at the equipment visible in the images, the heavy stone grinding wheels in the lower chamber, the gearing mechanisms above them, the wooden hoppers and chutes that directed grain from input to output, the broad leather belts and the wooden wheel shafts. She looked at the condition of what the photographs showed. She looked at the quality of light in the images, the particular quality of light in an old building photographed with a flash, the way it revealed surfaces and textures and the accumulated dust of decades. She looked at a photograph that showed the upper chamber of the mill, the room above the grinding floor, and she looked at what the photograph showed stored in that upper chamber, stacked along the walls, covered in canvas much the same way the furniture in the farmhouse was covered, the same deliberate act of protection before closure. She said, "When were these photographs taken?" Dorothea said, "Warren took them. I believe it was 1989 or 1990. He gave copies to the Society for the Archive." Renata looked at the covered shapes in the upper chamber. She said, "Do you know what's under the canvas?" Dorothea said, "Warren described it to me. He said Thomas Voss had been a collector. That in the years before the mill closed and Thomas died, he had been acquiring things, regional things, pieces from the area, tools and equipment and furniture from the farms and households around the county that were being sold off during the early Depression years when families were leaving. He had stored them in the upper chamber of the mill," Dorothea said, "because the mill was sound and dry and could be locked, and because Thomas apparently had some idea of preserving them, of keeping them from being broken up and sold as scrap. He had covered them the way you cover things you intend to come back to." "He never came back to them," Renata said. Dorothea said no. "He died in 1938, and the cousin who inherited had either not known what was in the upper chamber or had not been interested in knowing. The mill had been locked and left, and what Thomas Voss had gathered there had stayed gathered, because the subsequent owners had not had reason to open it, and the building was sound enough that time had not opened it for them." Renata looked at the photographs again. She thought about Thomas Voss in the early 1930s, buying up the pieces of other people's dismantled lives with whatever money he had left, covering them carefully, locking the door. She thought about Warren Voss in 1989, walking through that door for the first time and finding what Thomas had left. She thought about Warren putting a new padlock on the smaller door and coming to the Historical Society to ask questions and choosing not to sell. She thought about Gerald in October with mud on his boots. She thought about the key on the ring with the property documents. One key. The key for the gate and the house. Not a key for the newer padlock on the mill. She said, "Do you know what happened to Warren's papers? When he died? Whether there was a second key?" Dorothea said she did not know about the papers. She said she knew that Warren had spoken once about his intentions for the property, had said he meant to leave it to someone in the family who would know what to do with it. Had said there was someone he had in mind. Renata was quiet for a moment. She thought about Gerald, who had been a careful and precise man, who had kept his important documents in labeled folders, who had come back from Caldwell County in October with mud on his boots and a quality of quiet that she had never asked him to explain. Who had died before he told her. whose brother had left him a property and a key and, she was beginning to understand, an incomplete set of both. She said to Dorothea, "I think Warren meant the property for my husband. My husband died last year. It passed to me." Dorothea looked at her. She said, "Then you're the one he had in mind." She paused. "You just came a little later than he expected." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Renata drove home from Caldwell that afternoon with 6 pages of notes and the photographs Dorothea had allowed her to have copied and the particular quality of forward motion that she associated with problems that have revealed themselves sufficiently to be solved. She was not at the solution yet. She was still very much inside the problem. But she could see the shape of it now, could see the outline of what had been accumulated in that upper chamber and left waiting, and she could see what she needed to do next. She needed to find the second key. She went back to Gerald's filing cabinet the same evening, not to the folder labeled Warren, which she had already gone through carefully, but to the other folders, working her way through the alphabet of Gerald's organized life. He had been meticulous. 30 years of household and financial records in clear labeled folders, the kind of system that takes effort to build and more effort to maintain and that reveals, when you go through it after the person is gone, the particular quality of their attention to the practical dimensions of living. She had gone through these files in the weeks after his death for the estate, had found what she needed for the legal and financial process. She had not been looking then for what she was looking for now. She found it in a folder labeled miscellaneous, which was the only folder in the cabinet that was not specific, the only folder where Gerald had collected things that did not fit the other categories. Inside was the usual accumulation of a miscellaneous file, warranty cards, a manual for an appliance they no longer owned, a receipt for something she could not identify. And at the back of the folder, in a small envelope with nothing written on the outside, a key. It was a modern key, the kind that fits a standard padlock, the kind you would buy at a hardware store. She held it in her hand and thought about Gerald driving to Caldwell County in October and coming home in the evening with mud on his boots. And she thought about whether he had taken this key with him that day or whether he had found it somewhere on the property and brought it home. She thought about the newer padlock on the smaller door of the mill, and she thought about Warren putting it there in 1989 and keeping the key and at some point, before he died, giving it to Gerald. Or leaving it somewhere Gerald would find it. Somewhere Gerald had looked, on that October day, that she had not yet looked herself. She closed the folder. She put the key in the inside pocket of her jacket where she could feel it. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about what came next. Next was Thursday. She would go back on Thursday. She would go to the mill. She would open the smaller door. She did not sleep well on Wednesday night, which was unusual for her. She had always been a good sleeper, had managed her nights with the same organized efficiency she brought to her days, and the nights since Gerald died had been difficult in the specific way of the first months of widowhood, but she had come through that particular difficulty and had been sleeping reasonably well for several months. On Wednesday night she lay awake not from grief but from the particular wakefulness of anticipation, which she recognized and found she did not entirely mind. It had been a long time since she had felt the specific kind of anticipation that makes sleep feel like an interruption rather than a relief. She was 62 years old. She had buried a husband and managed an estate and sat in her living room while her sons put a folder with a cream-colored bow on her coffee table. She had driven to Caldwell County alone and walked through 8 rooms of a shuttered house and found the spring still running in the springhouse and the dark soil of the bottomland still rich under her boots. She had found Elias Voss's name in the front cover of a book and Thomas Voss's accumulation waiting in the upper chamber of a locked mill, and she had found a key in a miscellaneous folder in a filing cabinet that a careful and precise man had maintained for 30 years. She was 62, and she was lying awake in the particular pleasurable restlessness of someone who has something to go toward in the morning, and she thought that this was something she had not expected to feel again, and that feeling it again was its own kind of gift, unexpected and specific and entirely her own. Thursday came. She was in the car at 6:30. The road to Caldwell County looked different in the early morning than it did at any other hour. She had driven it 3 times now and had learned this. In the morning, before the day had fully committed to itself, the hill country had a quality of suspension, the ridges dark against a sky that was lightening but not yet light, the valleys still holding their night fog in the low places between the trees. She drove through it with the thermos on the seat beside her and the key in her jacket pocket and the notebook on the passenger seat, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was unusual for her and which she recognized as the mind doing what it does before something important, clearing space, putting aside the usual traffic of thought to make room for what was coming. She unlocked the gate at 7:15. The farmyard was quiet in the way of early morning on land that has been left alone long enough for the animals to reclaim it as their own. She heard birds she could not name from the tree line, and somewhere in the overgrown field to the east a sound that might have been a deer moving through the high grass. The brick of the farmhouse was darker in the morning light, almost brown, and the dew on the covered porch boards caught the low angle of the sun and made small points of light across the wood. She did not go into the house. She had been in the house. The house could wait. She walked directly across the farmyard and through the gap in the fence and into the overgrown fields, following the route she had learned on her previous visit, south and then east along the property line toward the curve of the creek where the sycamores stood and the mill waited in its position above the water. She walked steadily, not hurrying, because she had learned over 62 years that hurrying toward important things was a way of arriving before you were ready, and she wanted to be ready. The sycamores announced the creek before she could see it, their white upper branches distinct against the sky, the particular paleness of sycamore bark that makes them visible from a distance. She came through them and the mill was there, as it had been for over 100 years, the dark brick above the water, the millrace walls still standing, the door on the upstream side barred from within. She went to the downstream side. The smaller door. The newer padlock. She took the key from her jacket pocket. She looked at it for a moment, this small modern thing, brass-colored, ordinary in every respect except for where she had found it and what she understood it to mean. Warren had made this lock. Warren had kept this key. Warren had given it, at some point in the years before he died, to Gerald. And Gerald had come here in October and had come home changed, and had put the key in an unmarked envelope in a miscellaneous folder and had died before he told her what he had found. She fit the key into the padlock. It turned on the first try. The padlock opened. She removed it from the hasp and set it on the ground beside the door, and she lifted the latch, and she pushed the door open. The smell that came out was the smell she had encountered in the farmhouse, that quality of sealed preservation rather than abandonment, cool and dry and old, with the particular density of air that has not moved in a long time. But underneath it, in the mill, there was something else, the ghost of grain, she thought, the residual scent of the decades of milling that had soaked into the wood and the stone and the brick and had not fully left in the 90 years since the wheel stopped turning. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of work, of useful work done over a long time, embedded in the fabric of the place. She turned on the flashlight and stepped inside. The lower chamber of the mill was everything the photographs had suggested and more present than photographs can convey. The grinding stones were massive, each pair mounted on a wooden frame that had darkened with age to the color of old iron, the upper stone fitted above the lower on the wooden spindle that had once connected to the water wheel through the system of shafts and gearing visible above her head. The gearing was intact, the large wooden cog wheel on the main shaft, the smaller pinion gear beside it, the wooden teeth worn smooth with use but still fitted, still engaged, a mechanism frozen in time at the moment the water stopped. She put her hand on the main shaft. The wood was dry and solid. She thought about the last time this shaft had turned, sometime in the early 1930s, the last batch of grain ground, the wheel slowing, and the silence arriving, the silence that had been here ever since. She moved the flashlight across the lower chamber, noting the condition, the grain chutes and wooden hoppers still in place, dusty but intact, the stone floor swept clean in the way of a place that had been closed deliberately, not left mid-task. Thomas Voss or someone working for him had cleaned this floor before closing the door. The same care as the farmhouse. The same quality of intention about the leaving. The staircase to the upper chamber was along the far wall, steep in the manner of mill staircases, more ladder than stair, the treads narrow and the angle acute. She tested each tread before putting her weight on it, and each held. The wood was old, but it was the same quality as everything else here, built to outlast the purposes it was built for. The upper chamber opened before her as she came up through the stair opening, and she raised the flashlight, and she stopped moving. The room was larger than she had expected. It occupied the full footprint of the mill, perhaps 40 feet by 30, with the ceiling following the pitch of the roof to a peak above the center, and the light from 2 small windows on the creek side cutting through the dust that her entry had disturbed. And along every wall, stacked and arranged with the careful organization of someone who had thought about what they were storing and how to store it, covered in canvas that had grayed with decades of dust but still held its purpose, were the things Thomas Voss had gathered. She began at the nearest wall, and she began methodically, the way she did everything, lifting each canvas carefully, noting what was beneath before moving to the next. The first canvas covered a set of Windsor chairs, 6 of them, the kind made by hand in the late 19th century, the spindlebacks intact, the seats solid, the legs all present. She ran her hand along the back rail of the nearest. The wood was smooth, the finish long since dried to nothing, but the piece itself was sound. The second canvas covered a blanket chest, painted, the original painted decoration still visible beneath the dust, a pattern of stylized flowers in red and blue on a dark green ground, the kind of Pennsylvania Dutch decorative painting that had been common in the region when the families who settled the Ohio Hill Country had brought their traditions with them from the East. She opened the chest. Inside, folded with the same care as the furniture was covered, were quilts. She counted 7 before she stopped counting, each folded in the specific way of someone who understood that folded quilts hold their shape better than rolled ones. She lifted the corner of the topmost quilt and looked at the pattern. The stitching was fine, the kind of fine that takes months, that takes winter evenings by lamplight and the particular patience of someone who has learned that making beautiful things slowly is its own form of purpose. She stood up and looked at the room. She had uncovered 2 pieces, and she was already understanding the scale of what Thomas Voss had done. She moved the flashlight slowly across the covered shapes along all 4 walls, and she counted. She counted 23 separate covered forms of varying sizes, and stacked between and behind them, in the corners and along the spaces between the larger pieces, things that were not covered, ceramic crocks in graduated sizes, iron implements, tools whose purpose she recognized from her years of looking at old things in old places, a wooden butter mold, an iron kettle large enough to cook for a threshing crew, a row of stoneware jugs with the salt glaze still intact. She sat down on the floor of the upper chamber of the mill with her flashlight and her notebook, and she stayed there for a long time. She was not writing yet. She was looking. She was doing what she had learned to do in the important moments of her life, which was to be fully present in the moment before she began to act on it, to let the weight of it arrive completely before she started to manage it. Thomas Voss had watched the Depression dismantle the farms and households of Caldwell County one by one in the early 1930s, had watched the accumulation of generations being broken up and sold for what it would bring, had watched the particular cruelty of useful and beautiful things treated as if they had no value because the people who valued them could no longer afford to say so. And he had done what he could do, which was to buy them, to gather them, to bring them here and cover them and lock the door and intend to come back. He had not come back. But the things he had gathered had stayed covered and dry and present in the locked upper chamber of the mill his father had built in 1887, for 90 years, waiting. Warren had found them. Warren had understood what they were. Warren had put a new padlock on the door and come to the Historical Society and asked questions and held on to the property for 30 years without selling, because selling would have required a decision about what was in the upper chamber, and Warren, she was understanding, had not been certain what the right decision was. Or perhaps he had been certain, and the certainty had been that the decision was not his to make. That it belonged to someone else. He had meant to leave it to Gerald. Gerald had come in October and had found the key and had driven out here and had gone through this door and had climbed these stairs and had stood where she was standing now. And he had come home with mud on his boots and the particular quiet of a man who has found something too large to speak about quickly, who is taking his time, who intends to find the right words. He had not found the time. February had come instead, and the gray day, and then there had been no more time for the words he had been looking for. She sat on the floor of the upper chamber and she thought about Gerald, and she let herself feel the specific grief of understanding what he had been holding, what he had been preparing to share with her, the gift he had intended to bring her here to see. She felt it fully and she did not try to manage it, and after a time it settled into the place where grief settles when you stop fighting it, became part of the weight of the room rather than something separate from it. Then she picked up her notebook and she began to write. She wrote for an hour. She documented every canvas, every uncovered piece, every crock and implement and stoneware jug. She measured where she could with the tape measure and estimated where she could not. She photographed everything with her phone, moving the flashlight to illuminate what the small windows could not. She wrote descriptions in the specific language she had developed over 31 years of managing things carefully, language that was precise and unsentimental and complete. When she came down from the upper chamber and out through the small door into the morning light, the sun was fully up and the creek was catching it in the way of moving water that turns light into something alive. She stood by the door of the mill and looked at the creek for a moment. She thought about the wheel that had turned in that water for 40 years, the grain that had moved through the stones below and come out flour, the families of the county who had brought their harvest here and gone home with what they needed. She thought about Elias Voss standing on this bank in 1887 looking at the same water and seeing what it could do. She thought about what she was going to do next. The first call was to Dorothea at the Historical Society, because Dorothea knew the history and would know who to call. Dorothea answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Renata described what she had found in the upper chamber, the covered pieces, the quilts, the stoneware, the painted chest, the tools and implements along the walls. Dorothea was quiet for a moment after Renata finished. Then she said, "I was hoping that was still there. Warren never told me exactly what he had seen, but the way he talked about it made me think it was significant." Renata asked who she should contact. She said she wanted someone who could look at what was there and tell her accurately what it was and what it represented, not to sell it immediately, not to make any decision before she understood fully what she had, but to know. She said she wanted to know clearly before she decided anything. Dorothea said she knew exactly who to call. She said there was a woman at the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, an expert in regional decorative arts and material culture, who had been interested in Caldwell County's collection patterns from the Depression era, had written about them, had said more than once that there were stories in the rural counties that had not yet been told because the evidence was gone. Dorothea said she thought the evidence was not entirely gone. The second call was to Marcus. She made it standing beside the mill with the creek running behind her and the morning fully arrived around her. She told him she had been to the property in Caldwell County again. She told him she had found what was in the mill. She told him she needed him to come out here, not to manage the situation, not to make decisions, but to see it. Because it was his history too, and she thought he should see it before anyone else came. Marcus was quiet in the way he was quiet when something had moved him and he was deciding how to respond to it. He said, "Mom, are you all right?" She said, "I am better than all right. I am standing next to a mill that your great-great-grandfather built in 1887 and I have just come from a room full of things that were saved from the Depression by a man named Thomas Voss who was your grandfather's uncle, and I have spent the morning understanding that your father came here in October and found this and was trying to figure out how to tell me, and I think he would have wanted us both to see it." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'll come Saturday." She said, "Bring Priya if you want. Bring the children if you want. There is a springhouse with a spring that still runs and fields that go all the way to a creek and a barn with timbers that have been standing since before your father was born." She paused. "Bring boots. The ground is soft." She hung up and stood for another moment by the mill. The sun was fully on the brick now and the dark rose color of it was doing what it did in full light, which was to look like something that had been chosen rather than simply built, the color of a decision rather than an accident of material. She put her hand flat against the brick. It was warm already from the morning sun, warmer than the air, holding the heat the way old brick does, the way things built with sufficient mass and care hold what they are given. She thought about what Dorothea had said. That she was the one Warren had in mind. That she had just come a little later than he expected. She thought about her sons and the cream-colored folder and the photographs of the 900-square-foot unit with the granite countertops and the social director and the pool. She thought about the 43 acres under the Ohio sky, and the dark soil of the bottomland, and the spring still running in the springhouse, and the upper chamber of the mill where Thomas Voss's gathered things had been waiting through 90 years of locked silence for someone to come and understand what they were. She thought about Gerald, who had stood here in October and driven home with mud on his boots, who had been looking for the right words, who had run out of time before he found them. She thought she understood now what he would have said if February had not come so soon. She thought he would have said, "Come and see what we have." She thought he would have said it with the quiet pride of a man who has always known his family's worth but has not always had the words for it. She thought he would have brought her here in the spring, when the fields were coming back and the creek was running full, and he would have unlocked the small door and taken her up the steep staircase and raised a flashlight in the upper chamber and watched her face. She was 62 years old, standing in his place, doing what he had not had time to do. It felt, she thought, like something he had arranged. Not planned, not possible to plan, but arranged in the way that things arrange themselves when the people who love each other have paid enough attention to each other over enough years that the love continues to do its work even after one of them is gone. She picked up her thermos from the ground where she had set it. She poured the last of the coffee. She stood by the mill and drank it looking at the creek, and she made a list in her notebook of everything that needed to happen next, and the list was long and the morning was still young, and she was ready. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.